Many Americans today remember the attack on 9/11/2001 and how we felt afterwards. This was a similar feeling to how America felt after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Through research of the events surrounding the Pacific Theater in early to mid-1942, I have discovered why many historians, such as Andrew Knighton of the War History Online, consider Midway a turning point in the war. I plan to explain the history leading up to the battle, events to include Japanese downfalls and American successes, and the results of the battle and their implications for the Pacific Theater in World War II. First, let's begin in looking at the events leading up to Midway in order to understand its importance. There were several severe altercations between Japan and the US which gave importance to this historical event. On December 7th, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor was committed by an unprovoked Imperial Japanese Navy. Following that, the Doolittle Raid was in April of 1942, where the US launched Army bombers from a naval aircraft carrier in order to do a bombing raid on mainland Japan to show that they have the capability. Then in May of 1942, the Battle of Coral Sea took place, where the Allies were able to push back the advance of Japan into New Guinea and Tolgagi of the Solomon Islands, according to History.com. Now that we understand the backdrop for the Battle of Midway, let's examine some of the battle itself. In June of 1942, only 6 months after Pearl Harbor's attack, the Japanese planned to attack Midway to give a strategic position towards mainland United States. This is the United States over here. This is Hawaii, where Pearl Harbor was. This is Midway Island, and this is Japan over here. As you can see, Midway would expose the western coast. According to Solly of Smithsonian Magazine, Japan made several key mistakes in their planning. They tried remaining secretive and spread forces across the Pacific to include sending some of their fleet up towards the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, and as their fleet was approaching Midway, they had half of it trailing 100 miles behind, unable to respond to the fight. They were also prepared for bombing of Midway and had to scramble to disarm and rearm their planes with torpedoes when they discovered the US Navy just east of the island. Then Japan also was planning the attack using tried and true military tactics, as opposed to learning from the US Navy and how they participated in battles leading up to the Battle of Midway. In stark contrast with the Japanese downfalls, the US had several key successes. Leading up to the Battle of Midway, the US was working hard to recover from these previous altercations. Following Pearl Harbor, the USS Yorktown aircraft carrier was able to be repaired in only 2 days and returned to fleet. Then the US cracked Japan's code and was able to confirm Midway Island as the target of their attack weeks ahead of time. Despite the outdated Douglas Devastators and the unreliable torpedoes, the US was able to employ dive bombing, where the plane would approach from 20,000 feet in the air and at the last minute pull up, releasing their bomb. The US was able to do this against the littered decks with ordnance and fuel when Japan had to disarm and rearm to engage the Navy. The US Navy was also able to surprise Japan in hiding just to the east of the island. And according to an article by the World War II Museum in New Orleans, this was the cause of Japan's confusion during their rearming process. With these events laid out, let's examine the results and implications of the battle. As the U.S. Naval Historical website puts it, due to American intelligence analysis, judicious aircraft carrier tactics, and more than a little luck, the U.S. dealt a smashing defeat to the Imperial Japanese Navy. Although 3 American air carrier groups their performance was considered uneven by many, victory by courage, determination, and sacrifice was realized. In the end, the U.S. lost 1 carrier, the USS Yorktown, 1 destroyer, 144 aircraft, and 362 men. Comparatively, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 1 cruiser, hundreds of aircraft, and 3,057 men, 100 of which were their most experienced pilots and were irreplaceable. In a larger sense, the Japanese Navy was put on the defensive for much of the remainder of the war, and the advances that they planned for New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa were significantly postponed. The balance of sea power in the Pacific had officially begun to shift. In the 1970 film Tora Tora, Admiral Yamamoto, the commander of the Japan fleet, says, "I fear that all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant." While this may not be historically accurate, there is no doubt that America needed a great response to Pearl Harbor. Herein, we examined the history of the events leading up to the Battle of Midway, Japan's downfalls, America's successes, and the results and implications for the Pacific theater. Though so many years ago, and many of us weren't alive at that time, we can relate through the defensive feeling after an unprovoked attack. It was a time where there was a nation that united, and we were able to be Americans and show our strength to the world through an executed response.